Okay, so there's a bunch of things here on your site that we can discuss: secret space program, zero point energy, and all the rest of it. But for those that are not familiar with you, I guess I might as well have you do the same thing that I do to the vast majority of my guests when I give them on. I give them the chance to tell their life story from a primary source standpoint. What exactly have you experienced, and what exactly have you researched and found and seen in your life that's educated you and caused you to follow the specific things that you have done? Please be a primary source for everybody. Please make your talk fun and educational here. You got the floor. Here's Mark Candlish, and what does he do and what did he do?
I spent about 30 years in the aerospace and defense industry working as a conceptual artist. And basically that particular kind of job requires taking blueprints and technical drawings, informations, photographs and things of that nature from the different clients to create a realistic depiction of an aircraft or a weapon system as it will appear once it's built and in deployment as proposed. And so I had an opportunity to see an awful lot of interesting hardware throughout the industry. I worked for most of the major defense contractors: Boeing, Rockwell, McDonnell Douglas, Northrop, Lockheed Martin. And my dad was a 25-year veteran in the Air Force, and so I was around aircraft and things of that nature pretty much through most of my childhood and early youth. And it was during that time in 1966, my dad was stationed at Westover Air Force Base up in Chicopee, Massachusetts, which was the headquarters for 8th Air Force Strategic Air Command. And we had nuclear weapons on the base, and we had, because it was the height of the Cold War, we had B-52s with nukes on them cycling through the base about every 12 hours. And there were also a number of what were called alert aircraft that were fully loaded, ready for war, sitting at the southwestern corner of the ramp area for the aircraft in a little dogleg, little section of runway that came off the main runway that had kind of a herringbone pattern to it. You can still see it on Google Earth today. But I was taking the family dog out one last time for the night in, I think it was February of '66, and saw something strange hovering in the distance, and recognized that it didn't behave or have the lighting of a typical aircraft. So I ran back in the house, grabbed my 80 power Gilbert Science Company reflector telescope on a tripod. I ran out and watched this thing through the telescope for about 10 minutes before it began to drift away, and then suddenly shot off at a tremendous acceleration, something like it had been fired out of a cannon, executing a slight S-turn while it did so, and suddenly realized that I had seen something that was highly unusual. So all of that somehow was wiped from my memory. It wasn't until years later when, in 1988, a friend of mine from college and I were going to get together for an air show at Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, California. And he had indicated he had some clients that he might be bringing along to go to this air show. We were going to meet there, and might be able to network some jobs because he was working primarily as a designer in the industry. I was working as a conceptual artist. And turned out that the fellow that he wound up going there with was a high-ranking person who worked at Lockheed Skunk Works. And I had a pressing job assignment that weekend, was not able to go. But a week later when I talked to him, he described going to an exhibit that couldn't possibly have been available for public access. And so over the course of several years, I managed to get some of the details of that particular exhibit from him, which included a description of a number of high-tech classified aircraft, including the first-generation Aurora. And it included a description of 3 variations of the same type of a flying saucer, for lack of a better term. And ever since the sighting that I'd had in '66, I had always been curious about what kind of propulsion system these things had. And because I'd worked as a conceptual artist for so long, because I had an interest in machines and cars and had actually studied automotive design at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena for a number of years, I'm kind of a nuts and bolts person. I do all my own work on my cars, rebuild my own engines, transmissions, that kind of thing. And so this was really fascinating to me. But once I discovered that there really was something going on with the technology, I began to question whether or not the whole story of alien abductions and that kind of thing was even possible, that maybe what people have been seeing all these years was just some really highly classified hardware that was being operated by the U.S. military. So when I had the opportunity to cultivate friendships with people who were claiming that they had been abducted by aliens, I looked at this as yet another opportunity to find out if these people were really experiencing this kind of phenomenon, or whether it was just people were hungering for personal attention. And it turned out that the phenomenon was as real as a heart attack. I did cultivate a friendship with one particular group of individuals, and received an invitation to be in their home overnight when such an encounter was anticipated. And the reason that this individual was able to make such a prediction was because she had an implant in her ear, behind her eardrum, that you could actually physically see through the eardrum. Most people don't know this, but the eardrum is such a thin membrane, you can actually look right through the eardrum and see parts of the inner ear. And you could see this implant behind her eardrum with a professional quality otoscope. And this thing would go off, as she put it, about 24 hours before one of these encounters was supposed to happen. And so she let me know that on the 13th of the night of the 11th of December, 1989, into the morning of the 12th of December, that there would be some kind of an encounter. So I went over, took my camera, infrared film, and some other equipment to detect magnetic anomalies and this kind of thing. And she and I and her roommate sat up all night drinking caffeinated beverages to try and stay awake, and nothing happened. And then I basically plopped down on the couch in the living room. She and her roommate went back to their area to sleep because they had to go to work the next day. And being that it was December, of course, it's still dark at 7 o'clock in the morning. And at about 10 minutes to 7, all the dogs in the neighborhood started howling, and I mean howling as though they were being tortured. And lasted for exactly 90 seconds, and then they all stopped simultaneously. It was very spooky. And when that phenomenon ceased, I suddenly found myself fully awake and yet completely paralyzed, unable to move. I could still see my watch. I could see the passage of time. I could move my eyes around. And momentarily I almost started to panic, and then I remembered something my football coach had said back in school, that if you ever think you've been hit and that your spinal cord's damaged, you're paralyzed or something, just try and wiggle your toes. And if you can wiggle your toes, you're probably okay. It's just, you're stunned or temporarily, incapacitated. So I could wiggle my toes. I knew it was okay. So I devised a plan to get out of this situation, sort of, to roll myself off the couch, as it were. And I was in the process of doing that to try and break free from this restraint, whatever it was, when I was suddenly rendered unconscious in an instant. And the best way to describe that moment in time was if you were to take your clenched fist and press it against your temple and then abruptly apply some pressure so your knuckles pop. That was the sound that I heard in the middle of my head as I passed out. Woke up again a minute later. According to my watch, only a minute of time had passed. And from that point on, I was unable to even conceive of the possibility of trying to get out of this restraint, whatever kind of restraint it was. Somewhere way in the back of my mind was this quiet little voice who was saying, everything's okay. Don't be afraid. This is not for you. It'll be over soon. And that went on for an hour. And so at 10 minutes to 8, all the dogs in the neighborhood started howling again. It lasted exactly 90 seconds, just like the first time. And then suddenly I could move again. And the young lady came running out of her room and said, "Look at all the clocks." And I said, "Yeah, it's 10 minutes to 8, just like my watch." She says, No. She says, "The actual time is 10 minutes to 9. We've lost an hour of time." I'd never experienced anything like that before in my life. And I couldn't tell you whether I'd had any kind of personal face-to-face with some off-world entity. I don't really know, but one of the strange byproducts of that encounter was that she described she's one of the few individuals that I know of that had the ability within a day or two of being able to recall what had happened during the encounter. A lot of people are not able to do that without some sort of hypnotic regression. But she said that during the first cycle where this howling of the dogs began, there was a kind of portal that opened up in her room and out of this sort of a tunnel where everything that you would visually see in the bedroom, the chest of drawers, the wall, the windows, everything just sort of stretched like it was a big piece of elastic back into a tube. And that tube became like a tunnel, and then the tunnel opened up, and in walk a pair of these 4-foot tall gray aliens with the big eyes, the big heads, and the whole 9 yards. And so she was telepathically beckoned to face them, and they proceeded to show her 4 major cataclysms that would happen in the coming years. And they said that before or after these 4 events happened, that there would be a mass landing of off-world ships in the high desert of California. Now, she went on to describe the 4 events. She didn't know specifically what the date was, but she knew what the chronology was. And she said the first event involved she said, "I could see a major metropolitan area. There were all these skyscrapers. There were these 2 big buildings. They first, one after the other, caught on fire, and then a little while later, one building collapsed, and then the second building collapsed, and there was a huge pile of dust and debris." So that was obviously 9/11. She said the second event she saw was somewhere in the southwestern Pacific. She saw what looked like a fault on the ocean floor, and she saw the 2 sections on either side of this fault line shift. One lifted up, the other one dropped, and then they moved sideways a little bit. And then she saw a massive tsunami, and she said hundreds of thousands of people will die. And, of course, that was December 27th, 2004, I believe, in Banda Aceh, Indonesia. She said the next incident she saw, and she indicated that it would be at or above 9.0 on the Richter scale, which it actually happened to be. She said the next incident would be an earthquake of some kind off the coast of Japan. She said it would also be on the seafloor, but she said this one's going to be a lot worse for some reason, but she couldn't say exactly why it was going to be worse. She, of course, didn't know about the reactors blowing up at Fukushima Daiichi. But she said the last incident would be a major earthquake in California that would start with a series or a swarm of quakes near the Salton Sea, which has already started, by the way. And that this quake, the one that would trigger this major event, would be about 9.0 also, and that it would cause a chain reaction of quakes to ripple up the entire San Andreas Fault, and it would level San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco over the course of several hours or days, that it would be the greatest single loss of human life to a natural disaster in history. It would be damages in excess of trillions of dollars, and that it could probably cause a collapse of the California economy. So that has not happened yet. But the earthquakes near the Salton Sea have within the last 2 years have been picking up. So it's something I'm very concerned about. But I live way up in the northern half of the state, so we don't really feel too much of that kind of activity up here. Most of the quake activity we see in Northern California is off the coast near Eureka. But so if anything, what these predicted events showed was that these entities, whoever they are, have the ability to move forwards and backwards through time. which shows, of course, that there's something in physics that allows time travel to be possible. And in fact, the underlying science for the propulsion systems that these craft use is something that involves tapping into what are called quantum zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum, or zero-point energy. It's responsible for the effect of mass. Now, back in 2010, a friend of mine, Dr. Hal Puthoff from the University of Texas in Austin, wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society talking about using metric engineering for spaceflight. And somewhere around the third paragraph of that particular publication, he discusses the possibility of actually tapping into zero-point energy and using it to modify the mass and the rate of time in which a vehicle employing this technology would operate. So, in effect, what it's saying is that you can change the pace of time locally so that you can accomplish a lot more work in a lot less time, at least from the perspective of someone standing outside the disturbed region of space-time. He also indicated that one of the yardsticks of noting the use of this type of technology, this metric engineering, was that it would also cause an optical distortion where a vehicle, say something 50 yards across, might appear as a small globe of glowing light. Like the orbs that people describe all the time, that when these things are operating at a certain power level, that there is such a tremendous folding of space-time, bending of space-time, that you see an optical distortion so that the entire craft basically looks like a small ball of plasma, which of course is something that's often been associated with the formation of crop circles. Now, speaking of crop circles, some of the crop circles that have been generated over the last 30 years or so, if you go back a year later, and this is in the case of the genuine crop circles, not the ones that have been hoaxed by people with boards and ropes and this kind of thing, but the ones that are genuinely caused by the phenomenon that has been going on for hundreds of years, not just the last few decades. But it has been found that if you go back a year later and the crop is growing back in the following year, that there is kind of a universal pattern that has established itself in the soil, and it affects the growth of the crops. And this pattern is pretty much always the same, and it winds up being a circle with 48 spokes. Well, as it happens, the propulsion system in these craft that was developed by the military based on crash recoveries uses a series of plate capacitors in a circular array. Imagine a very large pizza pie with very thin slices, 48 in all. So you have 48 capacitor sections that are operational in the belly of the craft, the ventral surface of the craft. And so when these things are operating, and as I understand it, they're operating at voltages in excess of 1,250,000 volts. This produces a particular kind of ionizing radiation that even produces what are called X-ray photons. And X-ray photons, of course, can be lethal if you're exposed to them for any length of time, but they also produce kind of a almost like the same effect that you would see if something was exposed to microwave radiation or microwave emissions. And in fact, the crop circles, if you look at these plants under a microscope, you find that the growth nodes for the wheat and some of the other types of crops that are grown actually show sort of a blowout, as though the moisture that was inside the plant, which is concentrated in the growth nodes, actually turns to steam and has nowhere to go, and so it explodes outward from these growth nodes. The other thing, of course, is that when you're exposed to an environment where there's an event horizon extends out beyond the margin of these craft that renders just about anything in the environment with a reduced or almost no mass. And as a consequence of this sort of anti-gravity effect, the water that's in the plants essentially becomes weightless. It's not being held down in the structure of the plant because of its weight. And so the capillary action of the plant itself actually begins to draw it up into the plant more quickly, which means that the lower part of the plant becomes all limp and sort of like a wet noodle. So the plants actually begin to fall over and make these perfect lay patterns where the plants don't kink or sort of bend at a little sharp angle. It just becomes flaccid and loose, and it bends over very gently. That's one of the main things that you can see in these crop circles. The ones that are created by hoaxers basically have lots of broken stocks because you simply can't duplicate the same effect that you would have with the microwave radiation. So these are some of the different things that have all come into play in the research that I've been doing for the last 30 years or so. It extends over into the discussion of what some people call chemtrails or solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosols. I've actually seen evidence that these trails blown in the sky are being used as a means of obscuring the flight operations of these craft. Up here in Northern California where I live, UFO sightings are practically a nightly occurrence, and if you know where to look and when, especially after a day where the planes have been flying back and forth spraying all these trails, if you get far enough outside the metropolitan area of Redding, California, and look to the west, you can actually see these things flying around above that stratified layer of cloud cover. So it's as though they put down this layer so that it prevents the local population, at least in the higher density areas of the city, from actually seeing what's happening in the sky above. So that's my little spiel. So where would you like to go with this?
Well, in regards to the travel methods by which UFO craft could potentially travel through the cosmos and through other dimensions and whatnot, there's the basic methods, then there's really complex methods. I need to ask you to give me a minute or two to elaborate on this so I can give you the floor to see which ones the ETs or aliens, whatever you want to call them, are using. Stanton Friedman, when I interviewed him, he's more basic and down to earth. It seems that he's not really willing so much to talk about the faster than light stuff. He talked about magneto-hydraulic propulsion, I believe is the term, where nuclear fusion of sorts methodology is used to propel the craft. Also, Michio Kaku, the professor from City University, New York. There was a episode, Sci-Fi Science or whatever it's called, back in the day, where he talked about using monopoles to propel UFOs, and he talked about how turn on a monopole, which is not an opposite of a dipole. It only has one pole, and you can use the monopole to have the UFO or craft travel in any direction based on which monopole you are using. As far as faster than light travel goes, or should I say circumvent the speed of light, it's not really going faster than light as much as it's circumventing it. Did interview John Lear. He talked about how Bob Lazar is no fraud. He made it clear Stanton Friedman doesn't know what he's talking about trying to debug Bob. He doesn't take into account the fact that element 115 has many isotopes, and the kind that Bob Lazar was talking about comes from a solar system much bigger than ours, which allows for a much longer half-life to keep the element from decaying when you in a microsecond when you bombard with protons and whatnot. They've also talked about how the imaginary or pseudo-imaginary particle, the tachyon, which is said to go faster than light, can be put around a craft, and then once you have the whole thing around the tachyon around the craft, then you can enable the whole craft to go as fast as the tachyons that surround it are going. And then, of course, there's the whole wormhole thing. But the questions I've always asked about wormholes is, okay, you can create one part of the wormhole, one end of it, but, I mean, wouldn't you have to, in order to use a wormhole to get from point A to point B, wouldn't you have to, like, get to point B before you create the wormhole in order to be able to create to link the wormhole at 2 points? Whenever they talk about wormholes, they basically make it seem like the ET can just from its home base open a wormhole and then somehow, some way decide what other end of the universe the other end of the wormhole should open at. But they make I'm listening and I'm thinking, wait a minute, wouldn't the ET have to get to point B in order to be able to create the other end of the wormhole they want to get out of? And how would they get there if they didn't have the wormhole in the first place? So that's just a bunch of questions and a bunch of things I've thrown out. So as far as the kind of technology that they are using to get from point A to point B, and then after we talk about this, we can talk about the interdimensional aspect of this. But let's talk about getting from point A to point B within this dimension, within this universe. How are they doing it, and which technologies are the most popular, and which ones are the least popular based on what you've seen?
Okay. Good questions. I want to touch on some basic physics so people understand what the speed of light limitation is all about. When Einstein talked about this in general relativity back around 1906, I think it was, with the publishing of his theory of general relativity, he was saying that any object that has mass, and mass is something, it's a byproduct of the atomic structure of that object. For example, hydrogen has, I think it's a mass of 1 because it's basically a proton, a neutron, an electron. And, and then you move up from there and, you have uranium with a mass of, I think it's 235, and there's different isotopes, 238 and so forth, with 238 protons, neutrons, and electrons. So the more subatomic particles you have in the structure of an atom, the greater the mass is. And of course, what he was saying was that as you move through space-time, as you accelerate through space-time, that your mass will begin to increase. And the closer that you get to the speed of light, your mass will eventually begin moving upward in a parabolic curve in terms of the amount of mass that it is showing or manifesting as an effect. And it literally becomes infinite before you can get to the speed of light. And so it's impossible to ever physically travel faster than the speed of light because your mass becomes impossible to overcome in terms of having the fuel and the propulsive force available to move yourself forward through space and time. So the way that these craft get around that, they basically do a workaround, and it's really so simple when you think about it that it's kind of funny that no one has talked about this in the physics literature except for maybe somebody like Hal Puthoff, but when they found that zero-point energy existed, they were actually looking for a way of achieving absolute zero to see what kind of an effect that would have. And absolute zero is a condition where you try to remove all the residual heat that is contained in a gas or an object. This is caused by the warmth in the environment. You have the atoms of a gas, for example, that are always bouncing around, hitting one another. It's something called Brownian motion, and this movement is part of the absorption of heat from the environment. And so what they were trying to do is through using super cold liquids like liquid nitrogen and things like that, using cryogenic fluids to reduce the temperature of things so they could get them down to the point of going from a gas to a liquid, from a liquid to a solid like you have with carbon dioxide, where you can actually get dry ice, which is the solid version of that. Stand by for just a second. This is an unexpected phone call. I'm going to mute you for just a second here.
Don't you just hate it when that happens, folks? When you get a phone call during the show, I usually just press the forward button. But if he has to answer this, then I guess
I apologize.
It's all right. I was covering for you for just a couple seconds, saying you have the right to do this if it's an important call. So go right ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea was that if you could, in the search for absolute zero, for trying to find out exactly what temperature that was, and we're talking, hundreds of degrees below zero, they eventually discovered that even when you cooled things down to the point where there was almost no Brownian motion, no movement or vibration of the molecules of a substance, that there was still this oscillation. Max Planck called it in the German word Zitterbewegung, which means jitter or jiggle. And they determined that this energy was something that was caused by an electrical charge or flux that was it was embedded in the vacuum of space-time. And it operates at an infinite number of frequencies. It comes from every direction possible. And the energy density, there's been a lot of debate about how much energy there is in a cubic meter of space-time. I've heard it described in terms of there being enough energy in the volume of a coffee cup. If you could tap into all of that energy that was available, you could boil off the oceans of the entire planet, which is a tremendous energy density. Now, I've also talked to a number of physicists who said that if the energy density was that high that space-time itself would fold up into a giant singularity and the universe would cease to exist. So there's a lot of debate in the physics community about what the true level of this energy density is, but we know it's very, very high. And so the interesting thing about it is that even in spite of all this energy being in us and around us and in the environment, we have evolved so that we're unaffected by it. We don't even really see it because it's kind of this homogeneous background noise that exists in the universe. But if you can polarize this noise, if you can tap into it, you can then use that energy, and in so doing, you can actually take away from the amount of energy that would be available to increase the effect of mass as a vehicle or a spacecraft is accelerating through space-time. So if in fact you're tapping into this zero-point energy, you begin to create a kind of space-time bubble, or what physicist Miguel Alcubierre called a dynamically engineered local space-time, in which you are taking the zero-point energy out of that environment. You're using it to do work. You're creating propulsive force with this energy that you're tapping into, and you wind up with a deficit in terms of the amount of zero-point energy that would be there to continue raising the mass of the vehicle as it accelerates through space-time. And in fact, this dynamically engineered space-time bubble can actually move through space-time independently of what's going on around it, by in effect creating a vector in front of and behind this space-time bubble, so that it's almost like surfing on a wave, almost like a beach ball rolling down the front of a big wave on the ocean. And so, as Alcubierre put it, you can wind up achieving arbitrarily large speeds, which includes going at speeds in excess of the speed of light. And it's principally because you've done a workaround for the problem of the infinite mass issue that comes up as you begin moving closer and closer to the speed of light itself. So the interesting thing is that just in the last year or so, I've actually cultivated a friendship with an individual who's actually built one of these vehicles, had a hand in the engineering of it, had a chance to operate and fly it, and said that using these systems was far more simple than one might imagine, that it turns out that every star, every planet, every galaxy, every solar system has what is called a standing wave structure that is unique to the planet or the star or the solar system or the galaxy. Each one has its own signature frequency. And this sounds like so much New Age stuff, when you first begin to look at it. But if you were to take, say, a still body of water like a pond, and you drop a rock into it, and you see the little splash, and then you look at the waves that begin to spread out in a circle in all directions, radiating out from that point of impact, you'll notice that the waves right at the beginning of the impact are very high frequency. That is to say, the waves are very sharp and well defined, and as they get further and further out, they become more and more relaxed and gradual, and they begin to smooth out until out at the edge of where they're discernible, there's just a very long, smooth undulation in the water. And that actually is kind of a good three-dimensional representation of a standing wave structure in terms of how it affects space. It's the same reason why you'll find that in our solar system, for example, the planets around our star, the first few planets that are closest into the sun are in small orbits that get progressively further and further apart as you move further and further out. And then as you get out to the asteroid belt, beyond Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and so forth, you'll find that each subsequent orbit is at a further and further distance from, ratio-wise, from the previous orbit, so that it duplicates the same sort of structure that you see from the pebble impacting the smooth body of water, and that's a standing wave structure. But that structure can also be duplicated electromagnetically in terms of a signature that it produces in space-time. And this is how they are able to essentially tune and produce a what you would call a homing signal for the propulsion systems. They dial in the standing wave structural frequency for a distant star, and this is something that apparently they're able to determine through spectrographic data, looking at stars, mapping the star out in terms of its size, distance, and this kind of thing. They can actually see what the standing wave structure frequency for these different bodies are out in the cosmos, and they put these coordinates, these standing wave structure numbers, into their navigation system, and that's how they go from point A to point B. Now, the way that this individual described to me the operation of the system was that the big capacitor banks that were in this craft were fired up. They're powered by what amounted to some very large Tesla coils that were operating well over 1 million volts. They also have artificial gravity generators that are built into the system that create a type of field that locks in the level of gravity that you have, whatever your point of departure is. So let's say you're standing on the planet, you get into the spacecraft, it locks in the gravity as it exists wherever you happen to be at the time, and it persists after you launch. You go out into space and you're in an environment where you expect to be weightless. It just maintains that same type of environment as long as the system has its power turned on. That once they dial in the coordinates, the standing wave structure frequency of the target solar system, star, or planet, and basically it amounts to targeting first the solar system, then the star. You come into the solar system, and then you target the standing wave structure for the individual planet itself, and that's how you get to, it's basically like you start out and, you start with the book, and then the chapter, and then the paragraph, and then the sentence, that you're looking for in terms of where you want to go. And so that is how they navigate with these things. But he said that once they got out in space, they dialed in the coordinates of where they were going to, that the system was designed so they were using a synthetic vision system which used kind of a binocular camera system, so they had a three-dimensional image that they could see with the camera system, and that you could actually see a kind of a portal opening up in space where there was a distortion, almost like the magnetic what do they call it? Gravitational lensing that you see around some stars when reviewed through the telescope, in terms of the distortion of the field of stars behind them because of this gravitational lensing. But he said it had that kind of an appearance, and then they would go right into it. And in one instance, he said they went as far as the Andromeda Galaxy, and they made that trip, which I think is, 2,500,000 light years out, and did that in 20 minutes. Said that it took them just about 5 minutes to go to Jupiter and look at Jupiter. So I found this fascinating. My BS meter was kind of pegged at first when I began hearing some of the information, but as I began asking questions and trying to box in the details and figure out how everything was being done and what kind of technology was being used, it began to sound a lot more plausible to me based on everything that I'd heard from some of the physicists that I've spent the last 30 years talking to about the technology. But as far as what the favorite or the best type of technology is, I think that in truth, it's kind of like the development of the American automobile, that when these things first came out in the early 1900s, that they were using everything from steam to coal burning stoves and this kind of thing, and then eventually moved to petrol and oil and gas and this kind of thing. I mean, today you have lithium batteries powering electric cars. So there's a lot of different ways that you can achieve the same end result of propelling a craft. The methods and the technology that are employed, of course, probably varies depending on the level of technology that is possessed by the civilization that would be using that kind of technology to get from one point to another. But the basic process remains about the same, regardless of which technique you use to get there from one point to the other.
Thank you. And before we talk more about craft and whatnot, I'd like to divert for a bit and discuss mass, the subject of mass and what it is and what it isn't, because this seems to be a very, very confusing issue. A lot of people think we've been misled about a lot of things. In regards to, at its most fundamental level, what mass is, you have to study the work of Peter Higgs, who asserted that there was a particle known as the Higgs boson particle, which in 2013 was allegedly discovered by CERN, although many people are asserting we've been misled to about what CERN actually discovered, or if even the whole thing is made up. But anyway, the biggest thing about the Higgs particle that's pretty striking and eye-popping is the fact that you really can't make an analogy for it. People have tried, but even the analogies they made have flaws. The best analogy many people assert is think about the Higgs boson as paparazzi. What they mean is, like, imagine two people, each person representing a particle, moving across space-time, and then suddenly the Higgs boson, which can be thought of as paparazzi, approaches one of the individuals and starts like giving them mass by surrounding them and taking pictures of them, while the other particle has less paparazzi as it continues to travel across space-time away from the other particle, which was hindered by a much larger group of paparazzi, which means that it's going to have more mass. That's the best analogy that people seem to come up with in regards to describing what the Higgs particle is. But Peter Higgs asserted that he's done the math, he's done the work. He would not for the life of him be able to believe that the Higgs particle doesn't actually exist, because all the work he's done would assert that, well, it has to, and well, he's done the math, he says the work is there. So but then again, people don't understand, like, a lot of other things that seem to be related to mass, like gravity. What is gravity and what it isn't? I've heard many people say, okay, it's what the textbooks say it is, the fabric of curves caused by massive objects in space bending and warping space-time. But others have said, no, that's so third-dimensional and flawed. Gravity is the law of attraction. Well, that's what George Kavaslis said, but then again, Teal Swan, I should say, she got married, said that gravity is like the law of attraction, but it's slightly different. So, and then we've heard people say gravity is actually nothing to do with mass. It's actually has to do with radiation from a star, and those same people assert that stars, they're not nuclear fusion. They're actually electromagnetic and scalar energy in nature. But anyhow, specifically on the subject of mass, do you believe there is a Higgs boson particle? And if there is, how does it factor into this stuff that you've talked about regarding traveling through space and whatnot?
Well, honestly, I don't know if there's a Higgs boson or not. I have questions in my mind about whether it really exists. It may be that the math supports the idea of such a particle existing, but in describing what the characteristics of this particle, what the things that are attributed to it have been, it sounds to me pretty much like the process of how quantum zero-point energy is absorbed by the atomic structure of everything in the universe. I can draw a couple of analogies myself that might help people to understand that. Let's say, for example, that you have an atom that has a nucleus that's kind of like the sun. It has protons and neutrons. It's very energetic, and it's a very compact sort of central star or central component in the solar system. And then around that nucleus, you have a a constellation of electrons that are orbiting, not in the same plane of the ecliptic like in our solar system, but in all different directions. But they form kind of a cloud around the nucleus of the atom. And so this energy is being absorbed by all those subatomic particles, the electrons, the protons, and the neutrons, and they're all in the process of spinning. All of them are spinning. But when an object, and no matter how still things may seem, the Earth doesn't seem like it's really moving because we're actually a part of it, and we're sort of borrowing some of our inertia from the Earth itself. But we're moving at thousands of miles an hour right now as we sit here talking, even though we don't feel it. But if you move beyond that, what might be called a steady state condition, and you begin to accelerate at speeds beyond that steady state, the interaction with this zero-point energy in the environment begins to increase. And so I've drawn yet another analogy to help the audience members that are not intimately familiar with physics and all the equations. I couldn't do these equations to save my life, to be honest with you. But imagine that you're wearing a heavy coat. It's a winter time, and it starts to rain. And you're riding your bicycle through the rain, and as you become soaked to the bone with the rain, your coat becomes heavier and heavier. So imagine the raindrops represent zero-point energy. And so the faster you ride through the rainstorm, the heavier you get because of all the moisture that's being absorbed by your clothing, to the point where you become so heavy it's almost impossible to move. Now that's kind of like the idea of trying to accelerate through space-time and trying to get up to the speed of light, and you begin to absorb so much of the energy that your mass, your weight, and it's really not weight, but that's the kind of analogy I have to make here. But you become so heavy, so massive, that you cannot continue going any faster, because it's impossible with the amount of energy that you have available as a human being pumping the pedals of a bicycle. But let's say, for example, that you modified your bicycle in such a way that you had a little steam engine on it that was driving it, and you had a great big funnel sitting out in front of the bicycle that would collect all the raindrops that might otherwise land on you and soak your clothing and make your clothing heavier. And so as you begin to move faster and faster through the rainstorm, all of the raindrops are being gathered up by the funnel, and they're being driven into the steam engine. The steam engine is turning the water into steam, and it's powering you, going faster and faster and faster, to the point where the raindrops simply cannot get to you because you're moving so quickly. You're punching a hole through the environment and chewing up, using all of these droplets of water that might otherwise increase your weight. And so now you're actually traveling up and beyond a speed that you could ever achieve if you had all of this moisture soaking into your clothing and weighing you down. So that's kind of the analogy that I try to draw for people who want to understand how these propulsion systems might work, that you're tapping into this energy resource that's in the environment, that's everywhere throughout the universe, and you're using that to as a power source to drive your vehicle forward through space-time, to the point where you're actually able to go up and beyond the speed of light, which actually isn't as well defined as one might think. There have actually been experiments done now using plate capacitors, where they fired a laser between charged plates that come closer and closer together, and they find that the closer these plates come together, that there's actually kind of a shielding effect, so that the zero-point energy that radiates in from all different directions is actually blocking any kind of interaction in most of the different directions, except for right in the plane that this laser beam is firing. And they've found that they've been able to fire a laser and measure the speed of the light passing through that gap between the capacitor plates at speeds well in excess of the speed of light, which is about 186,000 miles per second. So it's not cast in stone. And so as far as gravity itself and how it relates to mass, this is one of the things that kind of links back to the propulsion system. When Einstein was writing his famous equation, E equals mc squared, in other words, energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared. C is the representation for the speed of light, and C, of course, is the factor of C times itself, or C squared. What he was saying was that there's equivalence between a certain level of energy and what happens when you take a mass and you accelerate it to the speed of light squared, if you were able to do that. It's a tremendous amount of energy. It's the basis for what happens in the explosion of a nuclear weapon. That's the kind of energy we're talking about in the release of this amount of energy that's bound up in the structure of the atom. So let's say that when you're talking about mass, mass has an equivalent amount of energy that would represent that mass. If you could convert all of the mass, all of the atomic structure into energy, it would represent a tremendous amount of energy. In a way, matter itself is almost like the condensation of energy. So if you put the energy on one side of a scale and the equivalent atomic structure on the other side, you'd find a balance between the two. That's what the equation is supposed to represent. And so what that also means is that if you have a certain type of gravitational force that's on the one side, what's to say that you can't substitute something else for that energy? And that is what happens when you put 1,250,000 volts of potential stored on a very, very large capacitor array, something that's 24 feet in diameter or 60 or 120 feet in diameter, with millions of volts stored in potential that doesn't short out. It's just sitting there. You have positive and negative plates where the charges are trying to get across the gap, which is basically blocked by an insulator, a type of dielectric material. In some instances, it's a type of quartz or glass. I've even seen capacitors that function in this capacity that were using 6-inch layers of the same kind of rubber that's used in tires, believe it or not. So, but the idea is that you can store a tremendous amount of energy on a capacitor, a extremely high voltage, high potential capacitor, and that stored energy is actually almost like a gravitational anomaly or a gravitational effect because of the energy and mass equivalence. And so the idea of mass is that if mass has a certain energy density, or it represents the same amount of energy on the other side of the scale, that what this does is it has the ability to cause a curvature, a bending of space-time, a distortion in the local field. Now, if you were to take a diaphragm, like a big sheet of rubber, and you draw a grid on that piece of rubber, this is kind of the way it's represented in a lot of the textbooks, and you put a bowling ball or some heavy object in the middle of that, you would see the diaphragm stretch down into kind of a valley that compensates for the weight of the bowling ball or whatever the object happens to be. And you see a distortion, you see a stretching of the distance between the lines that are delineated in this grid. And that represents this curvature of space-time. But you can do the same exact thing with a high energy density that's being stored on something like a capacitor. And so this is how you're able to actually create a kind of artificial gravitational field that's used for propulsive effects. Now, as far as the manifestation of mass itself, there are two theories or two thoughts about how it operates in space-time. One is that the accumulation of energy causes the distortion of space-time, and that's what causes other objects to be attracted to it. They kind of roll down into this valley caused by the curvature of space-time, and they are attracted. That's why meteors crash down on the Earth. When they get too close to the gravitational field of the Earth, they get pulled in and they come down through the atmosphere. You see a falling star. So, if you imagine that there's another possibility, and that is that the Earth itself acts like a great big shield, just like the plates that were done in what was called the Casimir experiments, where they tried to get the speed of light to accelerate by shooting a laser between those two charged plates. the Earth itself could be like one half of that shield, kind of like a unipolar or a single pole um, space-time polarization process, where the Earth itself is shielding the object from one particular direction. So all of this energy in the zero-point field that's radiating in from different angles doesn't affect the object that's moving past the Earth, but all of that radiation that's coming in from the side that's opposite the object. In other words, if you have a sphere represented by the Earth and you have this meteor that's moving in front of the Earth, and all of the energy that's behind us is sort of radiating towards the planet because the planet Earth is shielding the object on the one side. It means that all of this zero point and other types of radiation coming in is actually pushing the meteor towards the Earth because of the shielding effect. So in effect, this other theory proposes that gravity is really a pushing effect rather than a pulling or an attractive effect. It's a kind of shielding on the one side and a pushing on the other, and that was what would drive the two objects together. So you can see that it can be looked at from a couple of different perspectives, and it may actually work in either way. It's just a matter of figuring out the mathematics.
Yeah, math, easy for some people, complicated for a lot of people. But yes, some say Einstein flunked math, which I can certainly believe. Some people had Asperger's syndrome, but it was not known because that it was before the Asperger's was discovered. But anyhow, I'm digressing. I'd like to talk now about how this technology was obtained based on your website here on your homepage of your site. Says how the back engineered of off-world technology created powerful leverage for corporations to take over control of world government, blah 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 blah. Well, the idea that the UFOs that crashed on the Earth were the technology in those was back engineered. There's talk about that in pre-World War II with the Nazis and the whole craft from the Aldebaran star system crashing, and they back engineered that. And others assert that Roswell was also taken. It was, and some of the craft there was back engineered, but a lot of controversy there. Although, just as a side note, it seems that all the like UFO craft, Roswell and whatnot that we saw in like the years 1947 and a couple cases even before, watched a program about the UFO crash in San Antonio recently. Those UFO craft were from aliens who were freaked out over the atomic bombs being detonated, and they felt we got to come to Earth, we got to set things straight and whatnot. Well, some of those craft, for whatever the reason, crashed, and it's alleged we back engineered them. So, do you believe that there is truth to that whole thing about back engineering from ET craft?
Yes, I do. I don't know how much involvement the Nazis had. There's been a lot of discussion about the work of Victor Schauberger, who was a scientist who was experimenting with some of the turbulence patterns that he found in water, and his belief that these natural turbulence patterns could be used as a type of energy source. Some people refer to the work that he did as implosion technology. There does seem to be some legitimacy to the work that was done by Victor Schauberger. I've had people who used to work for Lockheed Skunk Works who've hinted that I should look very carefully at the work of Victor Schauberger and its influence in the science of hydrodynamics and this kind of thing. So I think that it may be possible that the Nazis were some of the first people to recover some of these crashed vehicles. They may have had some assistance from an off-world source. There's a lot of speculation about that, so I don't really advocate that that's the truth because I don't really know. But as far as what we have and what we've been dealing with, I know that not only has the U.S. military recovered a number of vehicles that have crashed. I mean, and people always wonder if there is a civilization from another star system that is advanced enough and has technology that is sophisticated enough they could get all the way to the planet Why would they ever uh, you know, be so crazy, so dumb as to have a mechanical malfunction of some time, after they get to Earth. Um, but you know, I'd like to say they're only human, but you can't really say they're only human. But,
Well, the
but
general consensus is they were shot down by either humans or some other group of ETs that, for whatever reason, felt they needed to shoot the craft down. That well, then again, that's not provable, but that seems to be what the general consensus is: shot down by against their will by someone else.
yeah, I've heard those stories. There's a lot of folklore in this field, as you can imagine. It happens that the incident that occurred northwest of Roswell, New Mexico, back in '47, I think it was, in June or July, corresponded with a series of really severe thunderstorms that had rolled through the area 1 or 2 nights before the craft was discovered on the Brazel Ranch. So there was some thought that perhaps the craft sustained a lightning strike while it was flying through the area. But I also know that at the time there were a lot of experiments being done at that time with some really high-powered radar test systems that were being conducted near the Four Corners area in the Southwest at a secret military facility that was down there, sort of the precursor to Area 51. One of the features of that particular primitive radar system was that they were really not very good at locking down a transmitter frequency. It was really a system that broadcast over a wider variety of frequencies, and as such, it was an awful lot like a system we have in use now that's especially effective at detecting stealth-type aircraft. It's called ultra-wideband, or UWB, radar, and it broadcasts on a variety of frequencies so that it helps to thwart some of the technology that's used in radar absorptive materials, like the kind that are used on the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber, the Spirit. So it's possible that some of these wideband microwave transmissions were actually responsible for jamming the flight control systems of these vehicles, and that was what caused them to crash. That's some of the folklore that has been circulating in the UFO community. I've been more concerned about how the propulsion technology itself works rather than trying to sort out what the true history is of some of these alleged crashes. There have been people that have said that there may have been as many as 48 different crashes around the world. I've cultivated friendships with people through Facebook from all over the world, and I have a friend who's from Brazil who said that there were crashes that occurred down there that were retrieved by the U.S. military as well. They basically just came in and confiscated everything, lock, stock, and barrel, with no resistance from the Brazilian government. So, they must have an awful lot of firepower. In fact, I know someone who built a device that worked back in the 80s that made a number of off-world trips, and one day the military showed up at his place and confiscated the thing that he had built. And that was kind of a hair-raising story all by itself. But, so exactly where these things came from, how they were built, I do feel fairly confident that they did receive inspiration from things that they collected that crashed. It seems entirely plausible to me that it's possible to travel the great distance through space and time and have encounter environmental conditions that you don't anticipate, like a really bad lightning storm or somebody experimenting locally with ultra-wideband radar that knocks out your guidance system. So, I think those things are possible, but whether or not they are the actual circumstance, historical circumstance for how these things were acquired, I don't really know.
All right, fair enough, fair enough. If you don't want to speculate, then I'll try to stay with stuff you can, in general, prove. But well, proof through science anyway. Zero point energy, a lot of speculation about that, but based on what the science shows, I guess we can say, okay, this is theoretically plausible and possible. So, well, in greater detail, I want to discuss zero point energy. Also, had a couple guests that talk about this on in the past, and one of them asserted that the phenomenon of cold fusion is, for all intents and purposes, the same thing as zero point energy, and also I also would like to get into how this may tie into what Nassim Haramein has talked about it in regards to the vacuum phenomenon, where he says that the universe expanding or contracting that violates the Newton's law of for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. There has to be someone who's either inflating or deflating the balloon being the analogy for the universe. That's like who's the guy who's providing the expansion, that's the action that produces the reaction of expansion of the universe. Well, Nassim Haramein asserts it's a vacuum of sorts, and one might ask, okay, how does that vacuum tie in with the obtaining zero point energy or using cold fusion to or some also I have used the term scalar energy. Is scalar energy the same thing as zero point energy, or are they different? That's another question I have to throw out to ask for you. So, how do all these things tie in, and can you make sense of all these things and how they may be related?
Sure. Okay. Um, as far as cold fusion is concerned, um, there are certain processes that will take advantage of the kinds of effects that you see that will produce what appear to be anomalous energy production. Resonance is one of those processes. The piezoelectric effect, where you put like a quartz crystal under pressure, it'll produce an electrical charge. These are things that you wouldn't expect to happen, but they do because of the structure of the materials that you're dealing with. Now, in the Pons-Fleischmann experiment that originally led to the discovery of what was called cold fusion, the idea was that they were using, I think it was palladium hydride, which is a crystalline structure of palladium metal. It was supersaturated with hydrogen. And they were putting an electrical current through this, and they were getting an anomalous amount of energy out of it. It was called cold fusion because, of course, it's not operating as a plasma like you would expect in the bowels of a nuclear reactor, which you get thousands of degrees and that kind of thing going on. But the idea was that they were getting some kind of reaction, and they were attributing it to some kind of situation where the nuclear structures, the atomic structures were coming together, just like in the hydrogen bomb, where you have hydrogen atoms coming together and producing a tremendous amount of energy in the fusion reaction, a reaction that can then trigger a sort of a chain reaction that spreads out through the environment and creates other reactions that duplicate this over and over again, so you get tremendous energy output. In the case of the palladium hydride, it was believed that at least the advocates that say that this may actually be a manifestation of zero-point energy were saying that what was really happening was that the palladium hydride crystals were actually resonating at a frequency that tapped into zero-point energy, and that was where the real power, the anomalous electrical flux or charge was coming from, was from this resonance that was achieved in the crystalline structure of the palladium hydride. So technically speaking, that's about as much as I can tell you on that end of things as far as cold fusion is concerned. But as far as scalar energy, there are a lot of different terms that are used to describe the phenomenon of zero-point energy. I think scalar has more to do with the kinds of frequencies that are actually detected of the energy when it manifests in the environment. Zero-point energy has more to do with the actual, the sort of homogeneous, multi-frequency environment that's embedded in space-time. But here again, I'm not an expert on this, so I would again be speculating to give you the kinds of details that I think you're looking for on that. I just don't really know enough about that to be able to expand on that much more than that. You had one other question too. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Well, it was the phenomenon of the vacuum that Nassim Haramein has
Oh,
pushed. That
okay.
that's the action reaction
Yeah.
answer to the universe expanding. The vacuum. Yeah.
Yeah.
How's that
Um,
fitting with this?
okay. Well, let me just say that they talk about the rate of expansion of the universe appears to be accelerating, and this is something that has been um, theorized by observations um, of light frequencies coming from distant stars. Um, there are a couple things here, and I think ultimately they're going to find that the universe is not expanding, at least in the way that they think that it is. And in fact, it may just be a turbulent environment with no expansion at all. Um, if you look at the idea, the concept of the universe expanding, it kind of reminds me of the way astronomy was viewed before Galileo, where everyone thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun, the moon, the stars, everything orbited around the Earth because they didn't have any understanding of astrophysics and planetary dynamics and all the rest of that stuff. But if you look at the redshift, and redshift is something you see. It's a kind of Doppler effect, and the way to describe that would be um, with how it affects sound. For example, when you have a car that's racing past you at 60 miles an hour, and as it's approaching you, the driver blows the horn, and it has kind of a higher frequency, and then as it passes and it's going away from you, the frequency drops. And the reason is that as it's approaching you, the sound waves are coming in at a faster rate because it's moving toward you. And then as it goes away, the sound actually has to move backwards through the environment to get to you. So the waves are hitting you at a slower rate, so the frequency drops. That's a Doppler effect. The same thing is true with light. If an object is moving towards you, the frequency of the white light shifts towards the blue because the wavelength of the light is actually, even though light cannot change its speed, it's a Lorentz invariant, as they say, even though the light is coming towards you, it can shift its frequency. So if the object is moving towards you and you're seeing the light, there's a bluish cast, there's a blue shift to the light. But if it's moving away from you, you see a red shift. And this red shift is what originally caused scientists to believe that the universe was expanding, because everywhere they looked out in the environment, they saw this kind of a red shift in the light of all the stars. But as the Hubble Space Telescope came on board and they began to look further and further out into the cosmos, 13 billion light years out, they noticed that the redshift that was out there on the very edges of the visible universe, the redshift was even greater than what they were seeing close in. And so they began to think that, well, this must tell us that the rate of expansion out at the very edges is even greater. Now, this, I think, is where Nassim Haramein's having his problem, or why he's questioning the legitimacy of these ideas, because, theoretically, if you have a big bang where all the material of the universe at some point is this giant sphere of material and it explodes outward, and this explosion is moving outward. Initially, there's this tremendous acceleration at the beginning of this explosion, the Big Bang, and then as objects get further and further out and the gases and so forth begin to condense into stars and planets and so forth, there's a deceleration. There's an energy dissipation into the environment, so things should theoretically slow down, but they don't appear to be because of this so-called redshift that suggests that things are actually beginning to move faster as they go out into space. So the problem is that it seems to contradict Newton's second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, where you see a dissipation of energy into the environment, so things begin to slow down. They don't expand outward faster, they actually begin to slow down. So it's a contradiction of that theory. So here's what I'm proposing, and I don't know whether this is something that Nassim Haramein agrees with, but it turns out that the speed of light which is represented by c in all of these equations that you see in the physics literature, it itself can be broken down into a number of other factors, which includes I think it's called the dielectric permeability and permittivity of spacetime. There are two other factors that actually determine what the speed of light is within the environment. And it turns out that any time light is moving through the cosmos and it passes, say, a blue giant star or a galaxy or a big nebula with a big gravitational field, that gravitational field has an influence in the environment because of the curvature of spacetime. And so every time the light passes through that environment, it changes the frequency of the light a little bit more to the red because it can't change. Light can't change its speed. Like I said, it always goes 186,000 miles per second through space, but it will change its frequency. And so the further out you get, the farther away that light has to come before we see it here on Earth, even with the most advanced instruments like the Hubble Space Telescope. The further that light has to travel means that it has more and more occasions where the light is passing through one gravitational field or another, whether it's a neutron star or a black hole or a galaxy or a nebula, whatever it is. The more times that light has to pass through all these environments where gravity plays a big influence on the light itself, the greater the redshift. And so, logically, it follows that the farther the light travels, the greater the redshift. It's almost like the atmospheric perspective you see when you're out in the environment here on Earth and you look way off in the distance. You notice that things that are further away have kind of a bluish cast, and it's called atmospheric perspective. And it has nothing to do with the Doppler effect, except that you're talking about all of the air that's between where you are and where the object in the distance is. And the farther you are away from that object, the more oxygen there is in between, and the more of a bluish cast that it has. So in the same way, stars that are 13 billion light years out there have had so many other occasions where they pass through gravitational fields that would affect the frequency of the light. You therefore see a higher degree of redshift from stars that are further out. So it doesn't mean that the universe is expanding at a greater rate the farther you go out. It means that the light itself has been influenced by all the gravitational fields it's had to pass through on the way to our optical sensing devices.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think Nassim ever really does get into the idea of whether or not redshift is a real phenomenon or not. I remember David Icke in his book, The Perception Deception, was actually questioning the truth value of redshift, and he's probably not the only one. But I'd like to switch gears here for a moment. Some of these UFO craft that you've got pictures of on your site, kind of interesting. One of the craft looks remarkably like what the Vimanas in the Hindu texts talk about. Michael Cremo, I interviewed him and on my show, and him and a lot of other followers are very assertive that the Hindu texts, even though they may be religious at their true core, the whole concept of how the crafts were constructed and how the Vimanas, how the texts talk about the science behind the Vimanas, that's definitely not something that's made up. That was created as the people who created texts to be genuine, true, accurate representations of it. And I have no reason to think that's not the case. I mean, it seems like the science is pretty valid behind how they could work with the whole Mercury thing and all. But even more so than that, the 1982 sighting Cedarville picture. I'm looking at this picture of this craft, and it has a platonic solid written all over it with the way it's shaped and all that. Like, this is what a platonic solid would look like if you unraveled it. It sort of looks like
Exactly.
Yeah, is that not an accident? Do you think that it does have to do with platonic solids in some way, the way this craft is designed?
Well, probably not platonic solids as much as stealth technology. That particular craft may actually be one of the only available photographs of what may be termed one of the first vehicles employed in the Solar Warden program. If you look back through the history of symbology used by NASA, you'll find this kind of strange V-looking shaped craft or object, or sort of a flourish in almost all of the NASA-based logos for the different programs. And there's a lot of people that suggest that it's a hint at some kind of early propulsion system that was employed on a secret basis for the Solar Warden program. But this particular photograph was taken back around 1982 or so up near Cedarville, California, which is up in the northeastern corner of the state, up near where it comes together with Oregon and Nevada. There's an area up there. It's actually called the Surprise Valley, where local residents have told me that they see what appear to be flight tests of different UFO types on a fairly regular basis, zipping back and forth down the length of this valley, which is surrounded on 2 or 3 sides by mountain ranges. So it makes for a really good place to do some training or some flight testing where you're kind of below the radar for any of the local air traffic control centers in the northwestern part of the United States. But same is true for Death Valley, of course, which is one of the lowest parts of the United States. But the faceted structure of that vehicle, and for those who are not able to see it, I can describe it as shaped somewhat like a large V, with sort of almost like an eagle's head and sort of a downward turned beak at the front. There's a sphere embedded in the center part at the front of the vehicle, and then there is a wing or a kind of a leg that comes off of each side in the back, forming a V kind of shaped configuration with another sphere embedded at the midpoint of each of those 2 wings or legs, if you want to call them that. But the entire surface of the vehicle, it has the same sort of triangular faceted texture to it that is very reminiscent of the F-117A stealth fighter that Lockheed Martin built back in the I guess it was the early 1980s. But it certainly suggests that having some kind of stealthy platform was one of the design requirements of that particular vehicle. Now, and in that incident, the fellow who saw that, who photographed that with a Polaroid camera — I've actually held the original Polaroid in my hands — was a fellow by the name of Arthur Reed. And he described how he was just sort of exploring that part of the state, driving along, and there was a kind of a rest stop. A few little campers had tents parked there, but there were all these cars pulled off to the side of the road, and everyone standing there, some people standing in the bed of their pickup trucks. We're all looking off to the west at something, and so he stopped and he got out, and here was this massive object. He said that it was somewhere between 300 and 600 feet long on a side, meaning, that from the point at the front end to the end of one of those wing-shaped appendages, that the object was pointed, had a nose-down attitude, banked slightly to the left, probably about maybe about a 25 or 30 degree nose down declination, and it was just hovering, probably 350 to 500 feet off the ground, and it was making this low rumbling kind of pulsing sound. He said you could feel it in your chest. It was so powerful. And he said the thing was at least a quarter of a mile away, probably between a quarter and a half a mile away, but it was absolutely huge, all covered black. There were a number of lights, there was sort of a V-shaped formation of red lights that came off the nose and ran up either side of the front part of the fuselage on this thing. And it sat there hovering like that for the better part of a half an hour. And he said looking at the people around him was really kind of a cross-section of the American society. He said there was one group of people on their knees praying to God for deliverance from this chariot of the devil, crying and sobbing and reaching their hands towards the sky. There were another group that were shaking their hats over their head, hooping and hollering like they're at a 4th of July celebration. And then there was another group that were running across the field. They jumped the fence and they were running out toward this thing saying, "Hey, take me for a ride." So it was a real cross-section of society. And he said, but after a while, he said, this thing it became louder. There was this rumbling sound. There was sort of a deep pulsing that undulated, got louder and louder. He says you could feel it in your chest, almost like somebody was sort of pounding on your chest. And he said, but this thing executed a maneuver that really showed that they had not sorted out whatever this flight control problem was, that put them in this position where they were pointed down instead of up, and they were banked to the left. And he said what this craft did was the nose lifted up and the tail dropped down as it continued in this left bank. So it did what amounted to basically a reverse somersault with a half twist, referring to the Olympics. Anyway, and it basically flipped end over end, so it was now pointing up and away from the crowd. And it did this as one smooth motion where the nose came up and it basically rotated along its longitudinal axis about 180 degrees while it was doing this, so that it was pointed up and away from the crowd. Then a few seconds later, it began to climb out, and it got up to about 2,000 or 3,000 feet altitude, and suddenly just was gone like a shot, went right out into space in an instant without a sound. So that was evidence for him that this was something employing a really, really advanced technology. It wasn't any kind of jet noise or exhaust or any of that kind of thing. Now, he went back less than a week later, and he stopped at this rest stop, got out of the car, he jumped over the fence, and he was walking out to the spot where this thing had been hovering, hoping that maybe he might be able to find some effects in the grass, maybe some kind of debris or something, that had fallen out of this thing while it was experiencing these flight control problems. And up rolls a blue Air Force truck with a pair of military cops in it. And they basically told him to get out of there, that he was trespassing, that if he didn't leave, they were going to arrest him and confiscate his vehicle. So he left. And this was in, the open countryside. Wasn't anywhere near a military reservation. So that's the story behind the Cedarville UFO incident. So what else can I tell you about that?
Well, the Vimana looking
Oh,
craft.
I'm sorry.
Are they the craft that look like that? Are they actually really designed to be just like the Vimana craft in the text, and do they function the way those Vimana texts say they do, with the Mercury and all the other things in them?
Okay, thank you for reminding me. The so-called alien reproduction vehicle, or Fluxliner, does use mercury in the central core of the propulsion system. Now, you may recall that the Vimana, based on the ancient Sanskrit texts, describe the power system for the Vimana as being what was called a mercury turbine. Now, it's interesting that even something dating back as far as these Sanskrit texts is concerned would make a mention of something involving liquid mercury and something like a turbine or a vortex of some kind. It turns out that if you subject mercury to a magnetic field and electrical current, that it will actually begin to spin all by itself. You can find videos of this right up on the internet. It's quite easy to find. And in fact, one of the very first motors that was ever created was created by Michael Faraday. It was called the Faraday Mercury motor. And it involved a glass petri dish with some mercury in it. He put a little permanent magnet right in the middle. He had kind of a scaffold, a little wooden scaffold, like a hangman's scaffold that stood next to the petri dish, and he had a long copper wire that was able to move freely, that was suspended from the scaffold, and then he clipped a wire on the edge of the petri dish so that it made contact with the mercury. He clipped another wire to the end of that copper strip that was dangling down from the scaffold into the liquid mercury, and then he connected those two wires to the poles of a battery so that there was direct current flowing through the mercury. And what happened was the mercury began rotating around the magnet in the middle, and while it did so, this copper strip that was dangling from the scaffold was actually orbiting the magnet. It was actually turning. Now, this is the most basic, the most simple type of mechanism that you could use for a motor, and in fact, this is what is kind of the drive mechanism for the core of the so-called alien reproduction vehicle. It has a mercury core. Now, when the first witness described this propulsion system to me and described that it had a mercury core and that there wasn't a lot of information about that, I couldn't understand why there wasn't something else that looked like a motor standing next to the central column that runs down through the middle of this vehicle that would cause the components to spin. There is also what looks like a circular disc or a floor that's right below the ejection seats that are on that column. There's three ejection seats mounted back to back on that column, and then right below them is about a 9-foot diameter disc. It turns out that disc is actually part of a homopolar generator. And then on the outside of the crew compartment, which is shaped like a big sphere, are a number of coils. There's about 141 loops that are embedded in glass that actually have a cross-section that looks like a quarter-inch square tubing, copper tubing, that functions both like a waveguide and also like the primary windings of a Tesla coil. And so the idea is that when you see people constructing Tesla coils to do experiments with high voltage discharges and this kind of thing, like the sort of things that you see in, the Frankenstein movie with the big lightning bolts going all over the place, a lot of those Tesla coils are constructed where you have a sort of a plastic or a quartz type cylinder that you wrap the windings around for the primary and the secondary coils, and you have two coils that are connected, and you put alternating current through these coils, and the length of the wire has to be matched in such a way that you achieve a kind of resonance between the two coils. But the shorter coil, the one that is larger in diameter but shorter in length, actually induces a current on the secondary coils, which have many, many more windings. And so as a consequence, you wind up with a much higher voltage produced when the electricity flows into the system. And it also is momentarily stored on a capacitor, which, of course, is part of the propulsion system. The whole bottom of the aircraft is like a giant capacitor array. So, but the thing that sets this system apart from your typical Tesla coil, where you have wire that's covered with kind of a lacquer insulation, you wrap the windings around the cylinder, and the windings are all right next to one another. And what a lot of electrical engineers may not take into consideration when they're building these Tesla coils is that because the coils are all right next to one another, you actually establish a kind of capacitive effect in the coil itself, and that reduces the overall output. And so by putting the loops of the coil in a powerful insulator like glass and separating the individual windings so they don't touch one another, you're able to produce a much higher voltage of electricity coming out of the system, which is exactly what you need if you want to have effects that will manifest only above 1,250,000 volts. That's how you do it. So this is one of the methods that's used. But when I was looking at all this, I couldn't figure out how the mercury was making this happen. It was only later that I found out about Faraday's mercury motor and the fact that it could be employed in such a way that it would function as a kind of turbine that would drive the machinery of the rest of the system. Because if that disk, the homopolar generator, has to turn, that means that the entire cylinder it's mounted to has to turn also. And of course, there's an outer sheath upon which the ejection seats are mounted, but the internal components of that cylinder are rotating. And in fact, this is when I began to see similarities between what Joseph P. Farrell had described as the Nazi bell that was being developed by the Nazis in the Wenceslas mine up in Poland right near the end of the Second World War, where they think that they may have actually figured out the keys to tapping into zero-point energy and developing propulsion systems that used a sort of anti-gravity type of a system, because that particular device actually had two counter-rotating cylinders with mercury circulating in between. So I began looking at this. Now, thinking back to my earlier discussion about cultivating this relationship with these people who had been involved in the abduction phenomenon, one of my hopes, one of my intentions in investigating that part of the phenomenon was to try and figure out whether or not, if any of these people had any recall of their encounters, that there might be a chance, however slight, that they might have seen or might have been given a tour of the engine room, so to speak, that they might have had an opportunity to see some of the technology that was being employed on these craft. And even if you don't know all of the engineering that goes into, say, a Chevrolet V8 engine, if you've ever seen one and you know what it is, if you see something very similar to that in the future, you could say, well, it looked like a Chevy small block V8 engine. And that person might not be able to tell you about the pistons or the piston rings or the valve clearances or any of that kind of stuff. But if they can tell you what it looked like, that gives you some clues as to how it operates. And so this one individual, the same individual who had invited me over for this encounter because of the implant in her ear, she described being aboard a vehicle and being given a tour of the power plant for this vehicle, and came into a large circular room with sort of a domed ceiling. It was what appeared to be a large glass column that ran from the floor to the ceiling, and there was sort of like a pit in the middle of the room with a railing around it. And as she looked across to the far side of the pit, she could see that beneath the floor she was standing on was a glass-like substance with all of these copper windings embedded in this glass-like substance, just like the windings that are wrapped around the belt line of the crew compartment for the flux liner, the alien reproduction vehicle. So that was one of the first clues. But then she said that the central column, this column, was spinning, and near the base of that column was a disk slightly larger in diameter that was spinning in the opposite direction. So it showed that there were counter-rotating elements in the system. But the thing that was most interesting was that she described this mercury-like, sort of a dark mercury-like fluid that was moving upward in this glass cylinder in the center of the room. But she said that there was a very distinct set of kind of turbulence patterns that she saw in the shimmering particles in this mercury. Or this mercury-like substance. And so I asked her to describe that, and what she described sounded a lot like what you see when you encounter an F5 tornado. You see a very large core tornado, and then you have a number of smaller sister tornadoes that are orbiting around the central tornado, but they're actually spinning in the opposite direction of the parent tornado in the middle. And so what she described was a series of these vortices that were spiraling up through the inside of this glass column, almost in a helical fashion, and that they were all rotating in one direction as the glass was rotating in the other. So what this really shows from the standpoint of hydrodynamics, fluid dynamics, is that there were actually two cylinders there, and they were spinning in opposite directions. But it would be the same as if you take a pencil and you put it between the palms of your hands and you move them in opposite directions. You get this twisting effect. And that was what was creating these turbulence patterns that she saw. So the fact that the material in the tube was moving upward showed that this was a closed loop. that the material would go up in the gap between the cylinders, and then it would return to the bottom down through the center. And this is where the massive electrical discharge for the system would occur. Now, in the diagram that was given to me by one of the original witnesses, inside that inner cylinder was what appeared to be a very long, I describe it as looking like a very long bottle brush, but it spirals up the inside of that cylinder, and this looked like some kind of a pickup for some manner of emissions that were being produced by the mercury when the electrical discharge was fired through the center. Now, there were some patents that were created by Hal Puthoff and Kenneth Shoulders, who unfortunately has now passed away, that were actually listed under something called the Jupiter Toy Company, that have to do with tapping into zero-point energy, and it actually describes a kind of a discharge orifice that's like a cone sitting down inside of a funnel, or a venturi, as it might be called. And at the narrowest part, the smallest part of that venturi is a kind of ring or annular anode, I guess it might be called. And the electrical discharge, while all of these components are turning in opposite directions, this electrical discharge fires across from the point of the cone in the middle to the ring that's around the edge of that opening. And because the mercury is coming up on the sides between the two cylinders and shooting down through this gap in that funnel, between the funnel and this cone-shaped electrode, that when the electrical discharge occurs there is a powerful kinetic force that is associated with that, and the mercury shoots down through this opening almost like water coming out of a shower massage. It's a pulse, and when it comes out of the orifice, because the bottom of the venturi is smaller than the diameter of that inner cylinder, it actually creates what would look like someone blowing a smoke ring, a cigar smoker blowing a smoke ring, a turbulent but self-stabilizing structure of ions, highly charged mercury ions that fire down through the inside of that cylinder. And these ions, this is actually sort of the same model that they have now assigned to what is called ball lightning. It's sort of a toroidal-shaped structure of ions, self-stabilizing, but it actually creates its own electromagnetic field, which is extremely powerful. It's the kind of thing that you would find in an electromagnetic pulse weapon. It's the kind of phenomenon that's associated with the mushroom cloud, that big plasma ring that rises off the detonation of a nuclear weapon, creates a tremendous amount of EMP. It's an electromagnetic field that's caused by that ring of plasma that's rising up off the ground. That's why all the electrical components get knocked out when such a device is detonated, especially if it's detonated at high altitude. But so imagine that you've got this mercury that's under tremendous pressure, and you've got this discharge that occurs in the mercury. It fires down through the central column, and it creates this ring-like structure, this smoke ring-like structure that's shooting down through the inside of the column. Now, this particular event has actually been compared to something that in physics is referred to as a virtual plasma. It doesn't have all of the high temperature side effects, the melting, and all of the destructive effects that you would expect from a plasma that, is very high temperature. But it has all of the other side effects, including the electromagnetic field and the precessing of the ions within the structure of that torus that's shooting down through the tube. And I've had one well-known theoretical physicist describe for me how many of his contemporaries and even this individual believe that this may actually be the doorway to tapping into zero-point energy, that this is how you would do it, is using a virtual plasma. So it seems to me that this is actually how they are in the process or able to engineer the same kind of thing that the Vimanas do, is by using this vortex that's created in the mercury, by controlling how the fluid itself moves through the system the fact that you've got two cylinders that are rotating in opposite directions. In fact, you'd probably have to have a planetary gear drive set so that you could actually control the rate of counter rotation for the inner and the outer cylinders, so you could make sure that it was constant and that it was even, so you could control the structure of the vortexes that are in the Mercury itself. But the idea is that by just like a football will stabilize itself because it's spinning when it's being thrown through the air, if you have an environment that is spinning as a fluid is moving through it, it stabilizes any structures, any turbulence patterns that are occurring in the fluid itself. And that's what this does. When the electrical discharge fires through the Mercury, you get this self-stabilizing structure that then forms kind of the doorway for tapping into the zero-point energy. And I believe that energy is then absorbed by this, what I called before, the bottle brush electrode that's on the inside of that internal cylinder, and that in turn is then stored as a very high potential on these highly insulated plate capacitors in the belly of the vehicle, and that in turn is controlled by a flight control system that allows you to control where the energy goes in that circular array, so that, for example, if you're going to reshape the field to steer the vehicle, you would put more energy on, say, the right side, and it would turn you to the left. Kind of like the swash plate system that's used on the main rotor for a helicopter. If you want to bank to the left, you get more lift on the right side. Same kind of idea, except that in this case you're just reshaping a field that's around the craft itself. So there you have it.
Thank you very much. A couple more questions, I guess, and then we'll call it a night. In regards to what percentage of the craft that we see up in the sky today, well, what is it? What could they be? Well, back in 2013 when I interviewed George Kavasilis, he said the majority of craft that we see up in the sky have some connection to the military-industrial complex. John Lear, in my interview with him, asserted that every single military-industrial complex based UFO does have some extraterrestrial nexus to it. Now, this was several years ago, and you think maybe the amount of military-industrial complex UFOs has decreased over time, so the percentage of what different UFOs are is not it's not the same as it was back in the day. So do you have any take on what UFOs are, and can you give a percentage on these are that, then those are that, or whatever?
Well, I share John Lear's opinion that the vast majority are probably Earth-based advanced technology systems. I think that the ratio is probably on the order of about 85% Earth-based to about 10 to 15% off-world, and maybe a very minor percentage might be from other countries or allies who have their own programs, because I know that is the case. I recently spoke to a fellow from Brazil. I think I mentioned this to you, or I know I've mentioned it sometime recently, that there was even a system that was developed down in Brazil by a private inventor that was confiscated by the U.S. military. But that's my feeling. Although just like the earlier analogy that I made with the automotive industry is, these systems are constantly being improved. They're constantly researching any and all information that they find from their off-world exploration and encounters with other civilizations and other levels of technology. Anything that they can do that will give us a technological advantage or some kind of an improvement where there is less of a footprint in the environment. I mean, as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, I saw an example of an extremely large cylinder-shaped craft that was exploiting something called quantum stealth, where the skin of the vehicle is actually connected to a video system that records the lighting conditions and the imagery in the environment, and then duplicates it on the opposite side of the craft. So you look up in the sky and you see something that looks like an optical distortion, or imagine a big cylinder made out of glass would probably be more like it. And the only shortcoming to the system is that when the sun is low on the horizon or has already set, and this thing is high enough to be bathed in the sunlight, the skin of the vehicle is so smooth that it still reflects the sunlight like a big piece of glass. And that, in fact, is what called my attention and a close friend's attention to this object as it was hovering probably about 4,000 or 5,000 feet off the ground. This thing was the size of an aircraft carrier, and it was like a cylinder that had just a sphere or half a sphere at each end. And so as it was slowly rotating or pivoting on its center axis, the sun gleamed down one of the sides, and then as the dome came swinging around slowly, there was a big flare in the sunlight in the stationary object. And then once you caught sight of that, you could actually see sort of the optical distortions of what the outline of the vehicle was. And right as I was pointing this out to my friend, I said, what is that? This thing took off like a shot. So it's, you have to think that there are technologies that are in use right now that actually provide that industrial military complex you talked about, full spectrum dominance just about anywhere in the world. Because if you can go into an environment and not be seen and not show up on any thermal imaging or radar system, then you can pretty much look over the shoulder of all your enemies, anyone who's in the environment, and they'll never know that you're there, which I think can cause as much concern for citizens of the United States, and their relationship with their own government as they can for anybody else around the world who worries about the United States getting a little too big for its britches. But still, I like to think that our country conducts itself honorably, but maybe that's not always true.
Yeah, and that leads into what I want to say next in regards to what's got to get done to make this stuff more public and mainstream. Well, the unfortunate reality of the matter is all these interviews that people like you and me are doing right now, and all these like whistleblower truths that are being put in like YouTube videos and other websites you can post this kind of stuff and make videos out of it, that unfortunately is not going to make something officially recognized as true, because for whatever the reason, society insists that the government and or mainstream media has to acknowledge a conspiracy or secret for it to be accepted as valid, which is kind of stupid because the government and the media lies more than lie, even with telling the truth to do it good. But for whatever reason, that's the way it is. And so what's got to be done for this stuff to become public? Well, it was brought to my attention at the Conscious Life Expo. Ted Marr, who I've interviewed a couple times and allegedly shared a past life with an Atlantis' shop owners, by the way. But anyhow, that's what someone said during my interview with him. But anyhow, he said when I asked him how back in June of 2016, speaker at the Ted Marr's conference in Washington State said that Edward Snowden's planning to release information, documents and whatnot, which for all intents and purposes will show that the 9/11 truth movement was right all along. And here we are almost 2 years after that conference, and Edward Snowden has released no such thing. I asked Ted Marr, well, what's the holdup in regards to this? And Ted got a little uneasy, and he was like, I really can't talk about this. He then said, I'll talk to you after this session. And then everybody in the audience was like, excuse me, we want to hear this too. And then I was forced to say, well, I'm sorry I asked. But Ted Marr did say, well, in a nutshell, the powers that be that still have control did say that if Edward Snowden were to expose those documents, innocent people are going to die. And he even went as far as saying that when Donald Trump met Henry Kissinger in the not-too-distant past, he did say that Henry Kissinger did at some point or another during that meeting tell Donald Trump, we will murder you and a lot of other innocent people if you don't go along with our conspiracies and our plots. Is that understood? So this raises the question, if they can threaten people in such a manner to keep people like Snowden from releasing documents that expose 9/11 as a fraud, then what's to stop them from threatening people from exposing UFO related stuff that shows that people like you and me are right all along and talking about this stuff? Well, I don't know. I guess it depends on how serious the secret is in regards to whether or not they will actually use such dastardly intimidation and fear techniques even make good on their threats. But would I've gone as far as saying in response to this, well, I think it's about time the human race suck it up and take it like a man and say, well, I don't care if you kill innocent people, I'm going to still expose the stuff anyway. And if people die, well, so what? Okay, and even if they threaten to kill your wife and kids, you might as well just suck it up and say, well, you're going to have to kill my wife and kids because I'm not going to shut up. I mean, is that the only way we're going to be able to expose this information? Not giving into this intimidation and fear. It's I know it's tough to talk about this kind of stuff, but it's a serious issue that's got to be addressed, and I'm addressing it now. Sorry to end the show on such a dastardly note, but anyhow, do you have any comments about this?
Well, I have personal friends that have been killed because of this information. There was a fellow by the name of James Allen, whose full name was James Allen Higgins, who produced a documentary. Started out as a film project for his thesis in college. He was a student at the Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah, Georgia, studying film production. And he decided that he wanted to do a documentary about my research into this propulsion technology, and it was very well received, so he decided to take it up to a feature-length documentary and release it to the public. And he was about 2 months from completing it when he became violently ill, was diagnosed with a very, very aggressive case of bile duct cancer. And we subsequently found that he had been somehow fed a cocktail of a variety of radioactive isotopes and heavy metals that included thorium, beryllium, uranium, cadmium, and just a whole shopping list of stuff that's bad for you if it's in your system. And that ultimately killed him 2 months later. His editor was the fellow who actually wound up finishing the film, and he was concerned about his own welfare, so he didn't turn it into a profitable venture. He put it up on Vimeo and YouTube, and you can go up there and see it. It's called Zero Point: The Story of Mark McCandlish and the Flux Liner, and but he died because of that. And just as recently as a week ago today, another friend of mine, William Whitecrow, also known as Bill Paris, here in Reading, was found hanged in his work shed. The circumstances are highly unusual. I've talked to a number of my friends in the Special Forces community, and there are a lot of indicators that suggest that it was a professional hit, not a suicide. So these are things, and this was a fellow who was someone who was authenticating a lot of what happened or has been going on with the secret space program. He was involved in it. He was on Mars and a number of other places as a part of that program, and had involvement with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Green Berets, and was an expert in martial arts. So, this is something that it happens. It has happened to a number of people. There are several other people I know that have also been knocked off. I believe Jerry Pippin was one. They used genetically modified MRSA on him. They used genetically modified MRSA on Gordon Ovell, who was trying very hard to commercialize the technology of the alien reproduction vehicle. They used that on a super soldier friend of mine whose name was Jeff Johnson. So there are a lot of different things that they can bring to bear in terms of silencing people. And so I think you're right that if we're ever going to see this information come out, that there's no doubt that some of us will wind up being sacrificed, on the altar of truth.
Yes, although, is there any solution to maybe prevent that? People hear me say the stuff I said earlier about you got to suck it up, and if people die because you exposed it, so what? Well, some would not really like to go about it that way and wonder, do we have any ways to prevent the deaths? Well, I just want to point out that I did interview an individual who was allegedly chanting higher consciousness entities, and I asked them, okay, how is Winston Trout not going to jail when he's got multiple felony charges against him for allegedly committing fraud? And and whatnot. And well, for all intents and purposes, their answer was, well, Winston Churchill, he said aliens told him he's not going to go to jail. He wasn't crazy. He actually has a lot of spiritual backing. For all intents and purposes, the higher level consciousness off-world entities are, you could say, meditating love in his direction, and also meditating it in the direction of the people who would be after him in order to prevent them from harming him or doing anything to him. And I hear that and I think, okay, so hypothetically, if you gather a lot of people together to meditate with the intent of spreading love to protect someone, then chances are that person will less likely end up dead for exposing truth than they would if they didn't have humans or aliens trying to protect them through meditating and radiating love from their hearts and whatnot. So that's just a potential solution that I have to try to keep whistleblower secret testimony revealing itself, causing damage and death, dare I say it. But there are other solutions, and people do have different takes on this. So no, I just maybe it made sense to end on that note to give a solution to the problem, just to give some hope and truth to it. But anyhow, Mark, I loved having you on. This was a great interview. Interesting site there you got there with the pictures and all that. You got a forum on your site, I see. Has this site been updated recently? People can contact you from it, but do you update the site regularly, or is it just one of those things that it's spur of the moment updates?
Well, it hasn't been updated in quite a while. If the friend of mine who put that together has had some medical issues that have kind of occupied his time, and so it hasn't seen an update in quite a while. But if there's anyone out there that has an interest in contacting me with the information that they have or information they'd like to share, you can find me on Facebook, Mark McCandlish on Facebook in Redding, California. And my email is very simple. It's just markmccandlish@gmail.com. So, I try to get to all the messages. I've had some very interesting testimony that's come to me through this pathway, and welcome the opportunity to talk to people who've had experiences and had sightings or have had involvement with some of the technology. You'd be surprised at some of the people that I've actually befriended over the last few years. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I believe I first heard about you in that 2015 Secret Space Conference presentation that was uploaded to YouTube. There's a Secret Space Conference YouTube channel that is based on the conference, but I don't think there's been any of those such conferences in a few years, although secret space conferences are taking place all the time, all over the place nowadays. So hope to see you at maybe one of them. So it was a pleasure talking to you. Loved having you on. I wish you the luck on whatever you do in your future endeavors, and forget about what happened on Wednesday. We sure as hell made it with it today. So,
yeah, I apologize. Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, Andrew. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you.
And I enjoyed hearing what you had to say. All right, take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.